Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. We'll start in a minute. We're just waiting for participants to connect, so give us a few minutes. I can see the number going up. We are now at 48 connected. We'll see if a few more will join. I think 129 have registered, so we'll see how far we get. Okay, I think we will get started slowly. So again, welcome to this webinar on aid in times of a changing climate, which has been organized by the Expert Group for Aid Studies, EBA. We're very pleased that so many have registered. As I said, 129 people. We'll see how many will join. And we assume that you are present in your homes or somewhere else. And we hope that we can provide you with an interesting and stimulating couple of hours in the isolation that I think most of you find yourselves in. There are many disadvantages of having to do it like this, but there are certain benefits as well, such as dress code. You only have to sort of go from here and up, and you can walk around and do whatever you like while listening, which would not have been possible if we had been in the Mediterranean Museum, where we usually have these seminars. So my name is Johan Shah. I'm the vice chair of the Expert Group for Aid Studies, which is a government committee with 10 members set up to contribute to the improvement of Swedish development cooperation. We are 10 members, the committee. We are supported by a very able secretariat with 7 staff. And in collaboration with researchers and other experts, we analyze and evaluate Swedish international development assistance. We primarily focus on overarching issues within Swedish development cooperation and not on individual projects that other actors can be expected to evaluate on their own. We define independently what it is that we want to study or evaluate. And the studies that we commission, authors of those studies are also independently doing their analysis and issuing their recommendations. So we like to talk about the double independence of EBA. And of course, our ambition is that we will bridge gaps between policy, research, and practice, and also through seminars provide a forum for dialogue and discussion of important issues within development cooperation. And of course, this is very much the ambition with today's webinar. Aid in times of a changing climate is about an evaluation of the Swedish government's climate change initiative, which took place 2009 to 12. This was a very ambitious, very comprehensive initiative in terms of funding and the number of interventions that were made. And it included as implementing actors both the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and SIDA, which makes it quite unique in terms of framing development cooperation. The evaluation will soon be presented by John Colvin, who is the team leader of Emerald Network, which carried out the evaluation. A few words about the modalities of this webinar and how you can come in and ask questions or make comments. You will only be able to see those of us who are presenting or in the panel on the screen. All other video cameras will be muted. All microphones will also be muted until we invite you to ask a question or make a comment. And you can announce your willingness to do that either through a chat. You have the chat function. If you're following this on Zoom, you have the chat function on the bottom of the screen. And this you can do already during the presentations and comments. Or you can raise your hand. There is a symbol also for that. And we will then, so you can either write your question or we will invite you to ask your question. We will then unmute your microphone. I hope this will work. I think many of us are already getting a bit used to this, the practice of doing webinars. So we will begin by John presenting the evaluation, and this has been pre-recorded. We wanted to make sure that there was no glitch or any technical problems while doing that, so it has been pre-recorded. And after that, I will present and invite the three panelists to make their comments, and then we will invite all of you to ask questions and comment also. So let's go to the pre-recorded presentation of the evaluation.
Thank you, Johan, for welcoming us to this webinar. I'd like to start by expressing my gratitude to the EBA for inviting us to work with them, to the members of the Evaluation Reference Group, and especially to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and CEDA for their inquiring and co-development approach in helping us to make sense of the evaluation findings, and to my colleagues Mutizu Mokute, Mejabin Abidi Habib, Jane Burt, Miriam Kugeli, and Jessica Wilson for their commitment to this work and a truly collaborative and rewarding effort. We live in highly unusual times, and it can sometimes feel difficult in this COVID-19 world we now inhabit to remember back even to last year, when public and political concern around global heating and the climate emergency rose to new levels. Of course, these issues have not gone away and continue to become even more relevant in the context of the existential threats of our times. They were and remain the backdrop of this evaluation, and they should inform the learning that comes from looking back over 10 years, even as we try to look forward to the next 10 years. The next 10 years are, as we all know, a critical decade for ensuring that as a planet we stay below 2 degrees Celsius of heating. They call for an unprecedented rate of decarbonisation. These challenges are compounded existentially by the 6th great extinction of our species and biodiversity that we must also confront. The UN Secretary General, in the series of climate action summits that he has been convening, is seeking the support of government, business and civil society leaders worldwide to address these interlinked challenges through 6 interlinked transitions, shown at the bottom of this slide. The transition I want to draw your attention to here is that of resilience and adaptation. While we hope for just transitions across the other 5 themes, we must also ensure that the most vulnerable are protected from and can recover quickly from climate and other shocks and stresses. Our global and national responses to the COVID-19 shock remind us of how our risk responses can so easily ignore or sideline the most vulnerable. So that's some of the background to this evaluation. In 2017, the EBA decided that in the face of ongoing climate challenges, it is imperative that Sweden continually try to learn, especially given the uncharted waters that we're trying to navigate, which means that we need to pay close attention to what we can learn from our past investments, and that an evaluation of Sweden's fast-track climate investments from 2009 to 12, the Climate Change Initiative, could offer a unique opportunity. Thus, the aim of the evaluation was to look back over 10 years and gain an in-depth understanding of the long-term effects and sustainability of the CCI, in order to generate lessons to inform Swedish climate aid ahead. This slide shows the context and timing of the CCI over a longer historical timeline. What we can see is that in the 1980s and 1990s, the main focus of climate funding was on financing climate mitigation. In the 2000s, there was an acceleration of financing for climate mitigation, but also new funding mechanisms to support climate change adaptation. For example, the Least Developed Countries Fund and the Adaptation Fund, even though they were slow to operationalize and their impact was relatively low. And that brings us at the end of that decade to COP15 at Copenhagen. The developed countries pledged $30 billion in fast start climate change finance, a commitment to mobilize $100 billion by 2020. And what we also see then is that there was a Swedish presidency of the EU, and this is when Sweden launched the CCI, a 4 billion krona surge of funding as part of a larger 7 billion package. And that takes us through then into the 2010s, when we've seen a continuing acceleration of mitigation financing and mainstreaming, the divestment movement, an expansion of funds dedicated to climate adaptation, and the mainstreaming of adaptation and resilience within development financing. So how was the CCI designed? Its objective was to effectively contribute to long-term adaptation efforts, especially in the poorest countries, and to developing countries' efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The bulk of CCI funding, 2.9 million krona, was to be directed to 17 multilateral funds, while the remainder was to be invested in 5 countries and 2 regional programs. While the multilateral funding was to be managed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the bilateral and regional funding was to be managed by SIDA. The focus of all the bilateral and regional funding was on adaptation, and this was also the focus of the majority, 56% of the multilateral funding. Our evaluation focused primarily on the adaptation component of CCI, although we did also undertake 2 mitigation-focused case studies. Now, 2 distinctive features of the CCI were that it comprised the new surge of funding, placing new demands on the MFA and SIDA, but also, consistent with Swedish aid practice, the CCI investments were guided by a set of 7 principles. And two to take note of here are Principle 1, that adaptation investments should go primarily to the poorest countries, and Principle 5, that allocations should reflect the work of the Commission on Climate Change and Development, which Sweden has set up 2 years previously and was to play an important role in shaping the CCI. The CCI was designed in such a way as to address some of the main challenges of adaptation investments. For example, should adaptation be understood as something separate to development or integral to mainstream development pathways? And around this time, there was a lot of debate around this, and the continuum diagram we see on the right-hand side of this slide shows some of this debate. Should adaptation funding primarily focus on confronting climate change and managing climate risks towards the right-hand side of that diagram, or should it focus on the broader drivers of vulnerability and building response capacity? This was closely linked to a debate about how to demonstrate that additional funding for adaptation was indeed additional, as opposed to the traditional ODA that has simply been rebranded. Well, to address these challenges, the CCI chose to address the full continuum of adaptation activities, building on the recommendations of the Commission on Climate Change and Development. It sought integration between mainstream development pathways, disaster risk reduction, and climate change adaptation. It focused on managing risks, building the resilience of the poorest, and enhancing the ecosystem functions on which they depend. It highlighted the need to address solutions at scale and with urgency, and it sought to facilitate new development pathways, challenging the established international development cooperation system to adjust and indeed to transform. To come then to our evaluation approach, its main features were that we took a principles-based and systemic design approach, the former aligning with the principles-based approach of the CCI. We developed a multiple layers design to explore multi-level governance issues. And you can see this in the layered approach to case studies and portfolio analysis in the main diagram. We actually undertook 11 studies in total and those little figures there showing the number of interviews we conducted for each. And finally, we adopted a utilization, learning and co-design focus, working with an evaluation reference group from the outset and meeting through 3 learning workshops. So, come to our findings. Our first set of findings look at the medium-term achievements of CCI, in other words, in 2013, at the end of the 4-year investment period. Examples of achievements shown here are for the bilateral investments. And these investments were spread across 5 complementary aspects of building adaptive capacity, namely, and I'm talking from the bottom green circle and reading clockwise, enhancing resilience to climate change, education, training and awareness on climate change, developing national climate change policies and strategies, strengthening governance for multi-actor collaborative planning, learning and action, and strengthening readiness to access international climate funds. And in each of these areas, there were significant achievements in many and sometimes all of the 5 countries targeted. For example, in all 5 countries, there was development of community adaptive capacities. And we're looking here again at the bottom green circle, which in turn contributed to community, ecosystem and built environment resilience, focusing on the most climate vulnerable communities and community members. And in 3 countries, there was strengthening of national ownership and readiness to access international adaptation funds through operationalization of national climate funds. While these achievements are important to note, of particular interest for this evaluation was the sustainability of these achievements over the longer term. In other words, the next 5 years from 2014 to 2019. And what we found was that many of the CCI achievements were sustained, and that in some cases, shown by the red arrows on the right-hand side of the diagram, achievements were sustained in part because Sweden invested in this case, local resilience practices, bottom red arrow, or mechanisms to access international climate funding, the middle red arrow. So in these cases, we can't talk about fully embedded sustainability. But in other cases, the blue arrows, outcomes were self-sustaining. For example, new governance structures, climate policies and strategies, and capacity building outcomes. Related to long-term sustainability of outcomes, but taking a broader impact focus, we were interested in assessing CCI's contribution to longer-term outcomes. Now, contribution analysis is an important evaluation tool, but hard to do well, particularly across a very broad, complex and multi-level portfolio. So these findings in some cases are indicative only, but nonetheless offer valuable insights. One of the areas where we looked at CCI's long-term contribution was around governance gaps, both horizontal and vertical, as this was a central theme highlighted by the Commission. Now, horizontal governance is concerned with coordination of both actors and sectoral perspectives. It addresses key questions of donor harmonisation, national government ownership, and multi-sector collaboration, including integrating climate, DRR, and mainstream development practices. So it was absolutely central to what the CCI was trying to achieve. And what we found in the evaluation was that there had been significant progress over the past decade in integrating climate, DRR, and mainstream development practices, as evidenced, for example, by the widespread focus today on resilience and on climate resilient development. The evaluation also revealed the breadth of Sweden's contribution to these developments, often as one voice amongst many, but sometimes standing out as more significant. For example, through its CCI investment in the World Food Programme and through sustained engagement on the World Food Programme board over many years, Sweden appears to have made a significant contribution. We also found that CCI was able to support multiple routes to adaptation and DRR mainstreaming in vulnerable countries. It did so by spreading half of its multilateral adaptation investments across 5 established development cooperation funds, the blue circles on the right, for example, the World Food Programme, the International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and the other half across 5 new funds, the green circles on the left, such as the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund, developing new adaptation policy, planning and practice. This contributed over the longer term to mainstreaming both from within development pathways, the first group of funds on the right, as well as from the outside in, the second group on the left. And good examples of this we identified in Sweden's investments in the Global Fund for Disaster Risk and Recovery and the Adaptation for Smallholder Agriculture programme. In both cases, the contributions of Sweden's early influencing, further leveraged through CCI investments, continue to be felt today. Likewise, Sweden has made a number of long-term contributions in helping to address vertical governance gaps, building on its commitment to champion the interests of the poorest countries and the most vulnerable communities. Notable examples arose from its pivotal role as chair of the Adaptation Fund Board and subsequently of the Green Climate Fund Board. On both these boards, Sweden was able to use its reputation and diplomatic skills to considerable effect. By bridging the interests and concerns of developed and developing nations, Sweden helped these boards develop as more collaborative and just spaces. And this in turn led to the agreement of policies such as mechanisms of direct access funding, so-called national implementing entities, that were more closely geared toward the adaptive capacities of poor country partners. This bridged a key vertical governance gap which has continued to plague other climate adaptation funds, such as the Least Developed Countries Fund. While challenges remain to allocate adequate financing through direct access entities, both the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund have made great strides in accrediting NIEs. Within the Adaptation Fund, more than 30 NIEs are now in existence, and NIEs form a majority among the 95 entities currently accredited to the Green Climate Fund. The evaluation highlighted several factors that have contributed to the achievements and longer-term contributions of Sweden's CCI in the adaptation field. One significant factor, supporting both its multilateral, regional and bilateral investments, was Sweden's distinctive leadership style and reputation comprising several facets. For example, Sweden was seen as a trusted partner with commitment and skills in building dialogue, trust and synergies. Also as a reliable partner, offering long-term consistent support and a stable political hand. For example, Sweden is the only country that has contributed funding continually since 2012 to the Adaptation Fund. Sweden's approach was in some cases described as frank and friendly, in other words, nuanced, not beating its own drum, but prepared to confront issues that matter. Sweden is also respected for its principles-focused approach, for example, as an ally of developing countries, a champion of unearmarked funding and of gender issues. And Sweden's role as a social innovator was highlighted in the regional Africa portfolio analysis. Alongside these enabling factors, the evaluation identified a number of factors which have constrained or limited Sweden's achievements and contributions. And here we note just two of these. The first concerns the way in which monitoring, evaluation and learning frameworks were developed across many of the multilateral funds and programs supported by Sweden. Support for effective climate adaptation requires particular kinds of MEL frameworks. And because of the need to track adaptation and learning, many standard MEL frameworks based on linear results-based management are insufficient for this purpose. For this reason, many innovative and climate adaptation relevant MEL frameworks have been developed over the past decade. However, these developments appear not to have been on the radar of the multilateral adaptation funds and programs supported by Sweden, nor were they on the radar of the CCI. As a result, while Sweden was an active champion of many multilateral boards, along with other donors, of a strengthened RBM approach, this was not necessarily well aligned to support climate change adaptation approaches and may even have constrained these. The second area of constraint is relevant to Sweden's successful advocacy for mechanisms of direct access funding, NIEs as we've already seen, that were introduced both by the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund. Here, despite the successful development of NIEs in the cases of the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund, there has been strong competition from alternative international implementing entities. For example, for the Adaptation Fund, in 2017, only 36% of total approved budget was given to NIEs, and the remainder to regional and multilateral implementing entities. The risk here is that international implementing entities, by being more remote from a country's priorities and national or subnational decision processes, may be less effective in developing contextually responsive adaptation initiatives and solutions than NIEs. And as an example of this, our case study of an adaptation fund initiative in Cambodia, implemented by an international implementing entity, shows that unintended outcomes towards maladaptation rather than adaptation are plausible in this case, which features both conflict and socio-ecological contradictions. Now let us come to some of our recommendations. Our first recommendation is that concerns alignment of aid principles in a rapidly climate change world. There has been significant progress over the decade in the integration of climate adaptation DRR into mainstream development pathways. For example, the Sendai, Paris and SDG agreements in 2015 have done much to advance this integration imperative, as we can see in the left-hand column. And Sweden's 2016 policy framework for development cooperation, the blue column, was quick to respond. More recent initiatives, such as the UN Secretary General's Climate Action Summits, have also shone a spotlight on integrative pathways. This is significant because we're now in a new geopolitical reality that demands that we place the climate and ecological emergencies center stage, such that we frame all development cooperation within this context. And the 2020 COVID-19 crisis, as I shall indicate in my final slides, further re-emphasizes this perspective. The evaluation findings reveal the many ways in which Sweden was able to contribute to horizontal integrative practices and to integration at regional, national and subnational levels. In the light of the climate and ecological emergencies, Sweden should now draw on this experience to ensure that it brings an integrated approach to all its development cooperation work. Furthermore, there should be a strong emphasis on rapid learning to spread and embed such practices. While we highlighted in an earlier slide a strategic mix of adaptation investments within the CCI bilateral portfolio, there was in fact no consistent framing of climate change adaptation that was applied across the full portfolio, beyond reference to alignment with the findings from the Commission's report. The evaluation therefore also recommends the need for clear conceptualization of successful climate change adaptation, including continuous learning to help guard against maladaptation. Rather than defining the concept, the evaluation points to 6 key factors that can be part of such conceptualization, including 1, a focus on increased adaptive capacity to both current and future risks, 2, articulating the relationship between adaptive capacity and resilience, 3, clarifying whose adaptive capacity matters. The concept we feel should include both subjective and objective measures, should include the prevention of maladaptation, and should emphasize planning for adaptation as a process, including continuous and adaptive learning. Now, we've already highlighted Sweden's CCI contributions over the past 10 years to improved horizontal and vertical governance of climate change adaptation. A new and emerging long-term governance contribution by Sweden's CCI and others concerns the need for better synergies between climate adaptation funds and sector-based funds such as World Food Programme, CGIAR and IFAD, and between smaller and larger climate adaptation funds. And these synergies, for example, at the country level, have the potential to link small-scale piloting with scaling through some of the larger funds. What this would do is it would bring greater coherence and transformational potential. However, when we look at the current coordination of multilateral and bilateral efforts at country level, what we see is a new governance gap and one which Sweden could now champion. And we suggest that one vehicle through which Sweden could contribute to the improved coordination of multilateral and bilateral efforts at country level would be to partner with the recently developed LDC Initiative for Effective Adaptation and Resilience. A further recommendation concerns the value and design of new investment surges. The CCI is an example of a focused and cutting-edge surge of funding. CCI demonstrated that funding surges have an important role to play in Sweden's development cooperation portfolio, provided that these are well-framed, are responsive to emerging strategic challenges of high relevance, for example, the biodiversity crisis and the challenge of transformative development, and are well designed. While the CCI was of its time, it demonstrated that it is important to follow through after the surge to enhance sustainability, that the design benefited strongly from prior intellectual work, in this case in the form of the Commission, which developed conceptual as well as practical advice, that flexibility and implementation benefited from the principles-based steering of the initiative, but was hampered by the emphasis put on primarily on result-based frameworks, and hence there is a need to focus on stronger adaptive and learning frameworks for the steering of funding surges. And finally, the learning from CCI can be applied to other kinds of investment as well as funding surges. And our final recommendation concerns the need to invest in monitoring, evaluation and learning systems that are appropriate for adaptive and transformative development. Through CCI, Sweden was, along with other donors, a champion of a results-based management approach. While results-based management can provide an effective complement to principles-based steering, it can also reduce management effectiveness in situations that require more adaptive and flexible approaches. The types of monitoring, evaluation and learning advocated by Sweden on multilateral boards in many cases reflected a misalignment with its principles-based approach. Other more flexible types of MEL systems are required for tracking, evaluating and adapting climate resilient development pathways and investments. As a result, learning about these pathways and investments was limited. Successful adaptation, in our view, requires incremental, adaptive and transformational learning. The Ministry for Foreign Affairs and CEDA have started to move away from more linear and narrowly defined results-based approaches, and this move should continue towards MEL systems that allow for continuous and transformative, sometimes known as triple loop learning. Knowledge capacity should be built in a way that deals both with high staff turnover and allows for future Swedish leadership capacity. I'd like to end with some final thoughts now that we're in a COVID-19 emergency that is likely to fundamentally reshape the future. And our conclusion is that what this emergency demands is actually an acceleration of resilient responses to climate, ecological and systemic shocks and stresses. So as we look forward to a just and sustainable future, although many futures of course may emerge, the key role of adaptive and resilient responses, especially for the most vulnerable, remains more vital than ever. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think this worked pretty well. There were a few moments when it was difficult to hear, but on the whole, great. And I thought your last slide was pretty quick, but I think if perhaps the audience can ultimately have access to that, where you showed sort of interaction between the current COVID crisis and the climate crisis, and there are areas of investment and action that would be robust in the sense that they are very relevant and meaningful for both kinds of crises. I wanted to ask you, this was an unusual evaluation. It was very comprehensive. You evaluated something that ended now 8 years ago. So it was complicated and complex. And on a personal note, is there anything that you sort of stood out for you? Any unexpected findings or surprises that you came across?
Yeah, well, I think what I'd say is it's not until you do this kind of work that you see the complexity of the multi-level and multi-actor landscape that Sweden and others are operating in. And I think what this helped to highlight for me was the significance of Sweden's contribution to the bigger picture over the past decade, that perhaps went beyond what Sweden expected. And in the context of this complexity, the other thing that stood out in some places is the sophistication of the CCA work that Sweden has been doing. And I think that matters because of the need for transformative approaches, as we were arguing in some of the later slides, that really are required in this times and will be particularly required to take us through and out the other side of this current multiple emergency that we now find ourselves in.
Great, thank you. I want to show, of course, the evaluation is available on our website. and as you said, it's a lot, but I just want to show people this is what it is. To make things a bit easier for those who don't have that much time, there is a condensed summary, a very few pages. There is the synthesis main report, and then we have published, I think, 7 case studies, but all the case studies are available on our website. So for those of you who want to go a bit deeper into this, all the material is available. So thank you again, John. I'd now like to invite our 3 panelists to make their comments, and I think we are fortunate in the sense that all our 3 panelists are uniquely placed, both in terms of having been around for a while and having followed and been very engaged in this discourse at the time of the work of the Commission on Climate Change and Development and during the time of the Climate Change Initiative. So you've been around, but you've also continued to stay engaged. So you've followed the evolution and the how this sphere has developed, what we have learned since we ended the initiative in 2012. And again, you are still in very important and influential positions in terms of climate policy and practice. So we're very glad to have all 3 of you with us. I'll start by asking Dr. Lisa Schipper to give her comments. Lisa is the Environmental Social Science Research Fellow at the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford University. She finds herself in Sweden now, but she's also the lead coordinating author in IPCC's next report, the chapter on climate resilient development pathways. So you are now in the process of actually working on exactly the kinds of issues that have been addressed in this evaluation. So I wanted to ask you, looking at this from a climate change and development perspective, in terms of the results that we see, the learning that has been done, and the fact that development to mainstream climate change action into development means both mitigation and adaptation elements. So, Lisa, what have you found? And I should say also that you were a member of the reference groups. You've been involved in the process of the evaluation from the beginning. So, Lisa, please.
Thank you, Johan, and also thank you to John. Yes, I was really lucky to be part as somebody who was really able to just come in and sit and listen to as this project evolved. I was really happy to have the opportunity to meet the project team and other people who are involved in this small group to support the project. And I found this extremely personally very satisfying, intellectually, of course, as well, but also because, like you said, I had been aware of this program when I was at Stockholm Environment Institute and the program began, and it was quite an important program for us. And so it was just really nice to have the opportunity to revisit this and to, of course, it was a lot of memories, good memories mostly. So I found this really, really exciting, but I'm also very impressed by the outputs because, as you see, it's extremely complicated and a very thorough study. So I think it's fantastic. I have, I guess, a couple of thoughts that have emerged. Some of that I've shared with the team over the course of the project, or rather evaluation. For me, one of the first things that emerges, which John pointed to, is essentially that this evaluation gave an opportunity to ask questions about the way that these different concepts were understood. So the way that adaptation was understood, and particularly the way that the role that adaptation development initiatives were supposed to play in driving forward adaptation. So I found that obviously, and as John pointed out, there were some inconsistencies across this, and that created some challenges. And I think this is really important to highlight, not just because I'm obsessed with definitions, but also because I think that it's fascinating to see that it actually does play out all the way through. It translate these differences translate all the way through from conceptualization to essentially to design, to implementation, and then to the outcomes. So I think then, it helps also to understand the results. What came out of the project, or sorry, the program, when you understand that there were differences in the way that adaptation was understood, for instance. So that was one thing that struck me. The other thing that has that is very important, I think this is in some ways the central question that you're also asking, is what is the role of aid in climate resilient development? Where do we think the future of aid is for ensuring climate resilient development, which is a kind of a nebulous concept that is poorly defined all over the place. But essentially, I think we understand this is the future that we have to go towards in some way. So there are two dimensions to this, and the first is really the sustainability, or the sort of long-term impacts of projects on climate change, on adaptation and mitigation. So how can we ensure that a project that's funded externally is actually sort of sustainable in the sense that it continues to have positive impacts rather than turn into something maladaptive, which John also mentioned. The other part of that is the question about whose agency, where is the agency and the ownership in these initiatives? And is it the people who are the beneficiaries, or those who have the money or the power, and who is making decisions about these projects and these initiatives? That also is important to think about. What role should aid have in climate resilient development? So I had two other points that I just wanted to raise, which is, one is, I think what the evaluation showed us, to some extent, we're still very uncertain of how adaptation should be mainstreamed or implemented in development planning, and how to do this, for instance, without enhancing negative things. So status quo that isn't very helpful towards adaptation, or power inequalities that are actually, making the people who are the most vulnerable even more vulnerable through the fact that people who are in power are the ones who will then be receiving the money, further marginalizing those who have no power. And we did a review paper with Siri Eriksson and a bunch of colleagues looking at examples of adaptation projects where we saw how vulnerabilities actually very often enhanced through these projects, not the SIDA funded one specifically, but generally across the world. And finally, I wanted to raise the point about transformation. And I think a lot of us really is sort of a buzzword. We're thinking that transformation is what we need in order to reach climate resilient development. And I think this is kind of where we really need to ask, how do we operationalize this maybe optimistic concept on transformation, especially if we're talking about integrating into development planning. And if we think that transformation is a central concept in climate resilient development, can aid be a channel for supporting transformation, or should this really be a country-driven kind of thing? And I think, especially as John said, if we're talking about framing the future, how we need to frame all development aid in the context of climate change, then what is really the role of this aid in the bigger picture on climate resilient development? And I think, I think I'll stop there. Those are the things that really stuck out to me.
Thank you. Very good, Lisa. Just let me follow up a little bit. And of course, I think for many of us, the observation that somehow aid modalities are not always a very good fit in terms of sort of organizing what countries need to do in terms of adaptation. Has that changed at all since between 2012 and now? Has there been a change in how climate finance is being challenged and managed at the national level?
I mean, I think what's important is that the difference now is that we actually have a lot more experience of adaptation projects being funded and implemented in many countries. And so we know that, I think to some extent, what kind of things seem to work and what kind of things don't work very well. But so I think the problem in many ways is that, for me, the bigger question is actually, can we, through aid financing development project, can we actually address these root causes, the root drivers of vulnerability to climate change that are there in the first place, was often very socioculturally embedded and things that are really difficult to address. So it could be beyond gender inequalities, it could be things like other cultural dimensions. And how would we actually expect external sort of projects to come in and address that? Is maybe what I would say to that.
Yeah, thanks. And maybe we should point out also that there's one of the case study, the one on the Adaptation Fund in Cambodia, which actually I think illustrates some of the points that you are making, particularly when aid sort of meets a highly problematic governance situation, to put it diplomatically. Okay, thank you, Lisa. We will now move to Heather McRae, who finds herself in Washington, D.C. Heather is the director of the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, and many of you know her from her years with the World Resources Institute, and also for having played a very important role in sort of helping us conceptualize and understand what adaptation is in relation to development. John showed a diagram which illustrated the relationship between interventions that are sort of addressing vulnerability generally, and those with a continuum towards those that are specifically climate related. And this is very much a legacy from Heather's work, a paper called Weathering the Storm that was published in, I don't know, 2007 or something like that, I think. And Lisa was a co-author on that paper. So Heather, when you look at this, and particularly from the way we conceptualized, again, adaptation at that time and how we now understand it, what is it that you see? What have you sort of noted in this evaluation? And perhaps you could also just say a word about, since you're now working on climate justice, what is that? And is that something that has appeared that you have identified in this evaluation? Please, Heather.
Thanks. Thank you, Johan. And thank you for the invitation to join this webinar today. As I think Lisa noted and you noted, Johan, this evaluation is quite unique and special, and it's really great and important to have this opportunity to look back at an important investment at an important time. I think the continuum that Lisa and I and others created back in 2007, first of all, it was very gratifying that it was taken up by the Commission and by the Swedish Climate Initiative. And in particular, the commitment and choice that was picked up in this evaluation to work all across that continuum was, I think, a very important piece of leadership at the time, because for so long in the climate funding space, there had been so much emphasis on additionality. And it was really driving investments in a way that didn't recognize the realities of vulnerability and the complexities of the contexts in which people are working to adapt. So those choices by the initiative, I think, were pretty important at that point. And also to, looking at the leadership, the Swedish leadership that John outlined and found in the evaluation across a number of different funds, it's also really important to keep in mind that leadership was significant in terms of broader shifts in funding, where there had been very little funding for adaptation in the context of climate finance. And that leadership in those funds, I think, was a really important turning point that still does not have adaptation at parity with mitigation, as various political commitments have been made at the global level by most counts. But that the attention that this issue began to receive at that point was very important, and the role of Sweden in these funds was quite significant there. And I think the use of the continuum was a good use and the right use at that juncture. in general, the point of this continuum is just to recognize that there is no clear additional boundary between what one would do to develop and what one does to adapt to climate change. You can't parachute into some place and figure out that distinction. That distinction is a process of understanding the climate change context, understanding all of the different drivers of a vulnerability context, and selecting activities and tools that may be very old out of a development toolkit or an activist toolkit or a human rights toolkit. Those tools may be very old, but applying them in a particular way in a particular climate change context is the crux of our point with that continuum. And as Lisa noted, it continues to be a work in progress. I would argue there's been a great deal of progress in integrating climate change into development, but this is not something that's complete. It's not something that can just be done. It's an ongoing learning process. And so I think a very important point in this evaluation is the centrality of that learning and the complexity of that learning and the need to continue to invest in learning in contrast to the results-based management approaches that continue to be structuring a lot of development investment, even though there has been some nuance and shift that's come to that RBM kind of thinking. That's sort of some of my reflections based on the continuum and my memory of the history of this work. Let me put my current hat on now and talk a little bit about climate justice. I am fortunate to run a very unique philanthropic fund that was created 3 years ago, and that is making grants to support women and youth and Indigenous peoples in developing solutions for climate resilience, advocating for those solutions, replicating them, and sharing them. We work to a large extent with a theory of change that is very bottom up. We look to support locally led solutions. We look to support advocacy for those solutions from the ground up to national policy and even to the global climate finance level. And it has been an extraordinary pleasure to get to work with activists and with creative people who share this vision of local empowerment. At the fund, when we think about climate justice, we essentially think of three different things. The first is just to recognize a rights-based approach and to make the case that human rights need to be central and need to be respected and upheld in all climate action. And I think the evaluation may have missed an opportunity to focus a little bit more on rights. My memory is that quite early on, Sweden was an advocate for rights-based approaches to climate action, and bringing a rights lens and a gender lens into this evaluation in maybe a more central way could have been helpful for all of us in linking the history to where we are now, where climate justice is getting a great deal more attention, and where gender, for example, in climate change is a really central issue. So John, I'd be interested in hearing more if there were things in the evaluation that maybe didn't rise to the top for those of us who mostly looked at the synthesis. Secondly, when it comes to climate justice, we do recognize the existing injustices, that there are differences in vulnerability based on who you are, where you are, what you do for a living, poverty status, other socioeconomic factors. And there's been a great deal of progress in recognizing differential vulnerability, I would argue since 2007, 2009. But there's still a ways to go, and there are still many investments that come from a very technocratic vantage point of, oh, we just build this piece of infrastructure or we put in place this particular technical practice. And those things cannot succeed without recognizing differential vulnerability, and they are unjust without recognizing it. And this adds to the complexity of the context in which we all work. But that complexity is is just how the world is. And then for us, the third piece, once those drivers of vulnerability have been recognized, empowerment is a core piece of climate justice. Strengthening the voices of people on the front lines, strengthening the voices of women and Indigenous peoples, of youth, of people who have been on the margins, making sure that the reins are in their hands in driving projects and driving investments. And I think this leads to some of linkages to what some of Lisa was describing in terms of agency and power and some of the problems that come with aid and its frameworks and its traditions. One of the things that I'm involved in that I'm very excited about is working with other funders and with grassroots networks to figure out, are there ways we can make it easier and more feasible for grassroots networks to receive aid funding, to control it, and to have vehicles and mechanisms to be more in control of the funding that comes to their communities. And this is, it's a kind of a clash of worlds, actually, when in many ways, when you have a grassroots women's group, for example, that is part of a federation at the national level, that maybe is linked up with a global network. We're beginning to see ways that very local work, which is critical. There are analyses out there of revolving funds at the very local level and the investment that poor households are making in their own communities and their own communities' resilience, and some of the ways to strengthen those investments and scale them. Bringing that up to link up with this global aid world and climate finance is not a simple task, but there's a set of us working on that now, and it's really exciting to see. I think, well, why don't I stop there? There's so much more to say, but thank you for this chance to make these remarks.
Thank you very much, Heather. I think you make some very important points, and I'm sure John would like to comment on this, but the fact that the three sort of aspects of climate justice, rights-based, differential vulnerabilities, and empowerment, I think were clearly not very strong not in the instructions for the climate change initiative, and maybe not so much in the general discourse at that time. But I'll ask John to comment on that. Also the aspect of what in the evaluation is called vertical governance linkages between the very local, the national, the regional, and the global, which of course is an ambition of the existing funding mechanisms, but whether it really happens or not, I think we need to look at that and discuss that. Just to ask you also, you talked about the need to really invest in learning and institutionalized learning. Have you seen that change and improve over time when we go back to 10 years ago?
Yes, I think there's there's a whole wealth of learning out there now, and there's various platforms and mechanisms, and I think we're in a moment that has been growing for quite some time in terms of the ways that learning occurs and the opportunities. I know Sweden has been very involved in the Global Resilience Partnership, for example, and there's an instance right now where I think we're seeing much more sophistication in partnerships and in networks and in bringing people together. I think there's still a lot to be learned about learning. I think we have quite a lot of untested assumptions as to what makes it work, and that we need to move some of these learning platforms beyond very simple storytelling and getting people in the same room, and probably dig into the messy details to some extent of what practices really work, bringing really solid educational principles into the kind of learning that we tend to do through international development and aid mechanisms. And I think actually the COVID moment is actually an interesting one from this perspective, because we have all suddenly been moved out of our typical conference holding mode, and we're on webinars like this one, and we're trying to engage remotely. And it's, for me at least, and for communities I'm part of, it's making us stop and really think, okay, what works in this and what doesn't work? And are there ways we can do this better? And if we do this remote learning better, what is it going to mean when we finally get to be together in the same place at the same time? And this is also to reflect too that, people like Lisa, many parents all over the planet are suddenly teachers. And I think that actually may have some interesting implications for us as learners and teachers of each other as well.
I can see a next webinar emerging out of this. Thank you so much, Heather. Now we go to Johan Kuylenstierna, who finds himself, I think, in Stockholm at the moment. Johan is currently the vice chair of something called the Swedish Climate Policy Council, which is a body instituted by the Swedish Parliament, and which is tasked to review independently and evaluate the implementation of Swedish climate policies. So it's in the very center, the core of studying and reviewing what Sweden has said it would do and what it actually does in terms, and this is across the field, I think, in terms of climate policy and action. Some of you know Johan as the former director of the Stockholm Environment Institute, and he has a long background in the UN working on water and etc. He also holds a chair at the Department of Physical Geography at Stockholm University at the moment. So Johan, you have this, you sit at the center, you are sort of overviewing the whole scene in terms of policy and practice, and you have also an international perspective. So what is it that you have found that, not least given Sweden's role in this complicated area?
Thank you very much, Johan, and also thank you to Lisa and Heather for very interesting interventions. It's always difficult to be the last person on a panel like this. I hope I can add a few things, but I also think there are some coherence between what we are actually saying here. As you said, Johan, you gave me the question a little bit about, looking at Sweden from an international perspective and in terms of a leadership position. And I think this is an interesting and relevant question. I base my observations on the evaluation that I read with great interest. It was an amazing evaluation to read. Very detailed, as you said, many interesting recommendations. But also my background then from working internationally in different agencies, UN agencies, but also from a Swedish policy perspective. I should say that the Swedish Climate Policy Council is focusing on Sweden, which is an interesting case in point. We are not looking at how Sweden is actually working from an international level right now. I first reacted when I got the question, evaluating something that happened between 2009 and 2012. And I first really felt, well, I'm not sure I'm interested. This is a long time ago. Then I realized I was very, limited in my thinking, because this is excellent. And as is stressed, it is so important to really look at the sustainability of a lot of things that we actually do. There is a disease almost in initiatives in the world. So we initiate things, a lot of money goes in, it ends, and that's it. So having this opportunity to look back at something that came at a very critical point, I would argue, in terms of climate policy, is really interesting and very valuable, and to draw conclusions from it. This was an important period, 2009 and 2012. It was just after the Copenhagen failure, that some likes to call it. I find Copenhagen to be successful. That can be another story, because it actually it pointed out the fact that we had some problems in terms of international policy making. But it came at that point, and I would argue made a difference for what we can then call the Paris success. So the short answer to your question, Johan, is that I think Sweden did contribute in many ways. There are two aspects here that clearly also come out in the evaluation. One is, of course, that you make financial commitments, and it is a substantial amount of money, you could argue, the 4 billion. But Sweden is still, so Sweden is a big donor in terms of per capita, but we are a small donor because we are a small country. So the other aspect is equally important, and I think the evaluation focuses very much on this. That's the thought leadership issue that also Lisa and Heather are talking about. And I would argue that Sweden did have a thought leadership role in this very critical time. It's difficult to evaluate that because we are one of many actors, of course, but still, I would argue we did. And if you follow through a little bit after 2012, there were a couple of other things coming that I would argue were important in that leadership perspective in terms of framing the new development pathways that you are talking very much about, which I think is so important because climate is only one aspect of so many others, and we have to frame it, development pathways. So the new climate economy project that came later on, and also the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, although focusing more on mitigation, they, I would argue, are interesting examples on how we were driving the whole rhetorics around climate towards linking it to development, broader development strategies, and not seeing it as an isolated environmental issue. This is still very difficult. And as you said, Johan, I come more from a water background. And I remember in 2009 being engaged in trying to get water into the climate agenda and the climate international policy. And I was also in some of the pre-meetings, and we were trying from UN Water to really drive this message that water is key, both in mitigation, but not least in terms of adaptation. And of course, you know that. I'll never forget when we organized a side event focusing on water and transboundary water as a key for climate adaptation and why this needed to be involved in the negotiations. And we had many negotiators, I will not say which countries they came from, coming to this side event and basically telling us, you're not welcome here. Water is too political. So it's easy to talk about, development pathways and integration and so on, but the political reality of really trying to bring in various aspects which are key for climate change adaptation becomes quickly very political. Agriculture, forestry, etc. You can search water in the Paris Agreement and you will not find it. So this is absolutely, essential to understand. And I think Sweden has really tried in many ways to broaden the agenda. So some other just quick feedback based also on the evaluation. So this was a window of opportunity this time. And I think that the fact that Sweden made a very firm commitment in terms of being one of the leaders when it came to the 100 billion climate finance ambition was absolutely key. What I also think is essential, and this was mentioned before, was the fact that it made a long-term commitment, and Sweden has followed through. It doesn't see this as a primarily political issue. It's actually a long-term commitment. It's a recognition, again, that building up quite complex climate financial systems, it takes time, and you need to be very committed over a long time. I would also argue, and I was following this discussion very much during my UN years, the whole issue of additional versus traditional ODA, that this was high on the agenda. This was a thought leadership issue again, because I would argue that partly the fact that we could go from the failure in Copenhagen to the success in Paris was the fact that it built confidence that we were looking at additional resources to support countries in terms of climate change mitigation and adaptation. So that was again an example, I think, of the thought leadership dimension. Another thing that I think Heather also mentioned was this continuum, the fact that we need to understand that policy making is actually, it needs to be linked between the local level, the national level, and global level. And I would argue this local national issue was one of the instruments, the understanding there for the whole transition to the NDC being one of the key, the national determined contribution being one of the key instruments for the Paris Agreement. Understanding that it is a national commitment that we need to make, but still also linking it to the local level. And the whole issue of national ownership. there are some critiques that I also would like to just mention, and I know that this can open a long debate. Looking at the evaluation, I think it's also quite clear that Sweden tends to go thin. I mean, of course, 4 billion kronor is a lot of money, but it's not more than 400 million. And the fact that 72% was spent on 17 multilateral funds, for example, there's a high risk there, to be honest. Other countries are, I would argue, quite often more strategic. I like the fact that you go through the multilateral system. I'm a big supporter of the multilateral system, but we also have to understand that if you want to be an influential actor in the multilateral system, you need to focus your resources. It's not just financial resources, but also in terms of human resources. There are some interesting examples how we managed to work with both financial resources and thought leadership in terms of the World Food Program, for instance, but also partly the Green Climate Fund. But I would argue that this is one of the big challenges we have. Sweden is quite invisible in most international organizations. So we are good at providing the resources, we are good at our commitments and follow through on the commitments, but we are weak in terms of being present more physically, I would argue. And this, I think, is important that, listening to John's comment, that also this is quite often appreciated by others, that we are representing a different sort of attitude or way of operating. I would also say that it's interesting, and this is maybe a very personal comment, but I would also argue that yes, Sweden as a country driving things, but also there are a lot of the need for strong individuals to be committed and work on this. I give one example, Lennart Båge, in terms of the Green Climate Fund. I mean, really strong personal commitment to follow through in some cases makes a big difference. So we are looking at the country, but I think this is also essential. I have a couple of other things, but I don't want to mention them. We need time for the discussions, but just maybe, Johan, looking ahead a little bit, what really we can take out of the sort of experience from Copenhagen to Paris, and also John's last picture, is the fact that we really have a new reality now happening, and we have to understand this when we talk about finance, international relations, collaboration. The playing field is very different today. This was the failure of Copenhagen. We didn't recognize that everything had changed since the early 1990s. Completely new political reality. We have a completely new political reality today, where also other actors are so essential. The private sector is playing a completely different role today than it did 5-10 years ago in terms of climate, in terms of investments, etc., etc. So I think when learning from this evaluation is extremely important, but also then translating this into the quickly changing landscape that we see today also on the international arena, that will force us to think in completely different ways than we did only 5-10 years ago. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Johan, and thank you for taking this critical view and positioning what was done then in today's landscape and today's realities. And I hear you saying that we may have been a thought leader at the time of Copenhagen and during that period, but the world has changed, and the question is whether we really managed to use whatever potential role we could have in influencing these realities. Great, and of course, looking ahead, yes, difficult, if I may summarize. Let me go back to John and just take a few minutes. You don't have to comment on all of this, but if you want to pick a couple of issues that you felt are really important that we may need to sort of look more deeply at and continue to address. John.
Thank you, Johan, and thank you to Lisa, to Heather, and to Johan for your very interesting reflections and comments. I'm going to try and pick up on comments that each of you have made and weave them together in various ways. First of all, I want to start with Heather's reflections about the fact that we still have a lot to learn about learning. I couldn't agree more, and her comment that it's actually in the nitty-gritty of learning practices that we need to learn, And I think one of the things that we opened up in this evaluation through a co-design approach and the very valuable work and input of the evaluation reference group, and particularly through, as part of that, our engagement with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and CEDA, was that we opened up a learning process that links these different levels of governance that I want to come on to in a minute. And our hope is that that learning process could develop and expand. So in recommending to Sweden that it takes forward its work on integration and linking of adaptation and development in more learningful ways, I hope it can build out from what we've already started together. The second point I want to comment on is really this issue about justice and vertical governance and whose voices count, and how we can work much more effectively to support voices of the most excluded, the most disadvantaged, and those with the least agency. And it was very interesting for us in designing this evaluation. We had this opportunity to try and cover and bring together the findings between these different levels of governance, from the multilateral global to the regional to the country level, and then down into communities. And I think one of the things that we as Emerald Network learned from this is the real importance of always staying grounded and embodied in the local level upwards. But to come to how that comes through in the evaluation, I think there were spaces, particularly, and I'll single out the Adaptation Fund here, where you are starting to see a move towards empowerment, and that comes out of the early influence of Sweden on the board, championing the national implementing entities, and that's now grown out into experimenting with enhanced direct access, for example, in South Africa through the small grants facility, as well as trying to embed these issues more strongly in policy. So I think the Adaptation Fund is a very good example of where this more strongly bottom-up led approach, which also speaks to Lisa's points about agency and ownership, and how which beneficiaries count and how. And I think that then brings us on to the gender issue, which is very closely linked with this. And I agree with you, Heather. I think we did miss a trick. I mean, there are gender stories in that evaluation, but I don't think that we really bring them out strongly enough in the way that we pull it all together. Because actually, Sweden played a very strong role. If I just focus on the multilateral funds, it may have spread itself thinly across 17, but it was a great champion of gender across all of those. And it was really pushing hard in some cases for policies that went beyond do no harm to a much stronger position on women's agency and empowerment. And I think, again, the Adaptation Fund is a good case in point. And I don't know if it's the right point to bring in my colleagues, but I know that Jane Burt could speak to this further. And I know that Mutisma Mukute could speak to this in very interesting ways from his observations and findings in Mali. And I know that Mejabin Abidi Habib could speak to this in very interesting ways from her findings in Cambodia, which we're finding much more maladaptive. So this may not be the point, but there's actually lots of there are some really important findings there which we need to highlight as we continue to think about, and I'm going to finish in a minute now, how to do transformative development well. I think this issue of vertical governance and bottom-up voices is absolutely critical to that.
Thank you, John. It's good. We know that we have other members of the team are there, but let's see if we get any questions or comments from space now. I'm asking my colleagues in the Secretariat. I don't see anything on my screen at the moment, but you are welcome to raise your hand or through the chat function. Let us know if you would like to comment or ask a question.
Sure.
Hi, Matt.
We have received one question over the chat function, which is the following. Have you considered an increased use of geo-information services to support monitoring and prevent maladaptation? Now more than ever, Earth observation services can be of help. Donatella Giampaolo asked that question. And so far, we have not noticed any raised hands.
So let's go for that one, and maybe I can flag, and Lisa would like to respond to that. And I could maybe flag that EBA, we issued last year a study using geospatial techniques, looking at local development in Cambodia. So anyone who's interested in the methodology can go there. But please, Lisa, would you like to comment?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I haven't used any geospatial techniques for anything, but and so I probably have some limited understanding of what it is. But I think the challenge in really is that it's difficult for us to know when maladaptation is happening until it's there. It's very difficult to know when things are evolving towards in a maladaptive direction. And this is part of the work that someone was trying to do to try to identify sort of, can we use adaptation pathways as a concept to try to sort of map different ways and therefore say, oh, at some point this is not going in a good direction. Yeah. But because maladaptation is very often extremely subjective, I mean, it can be that maladaptation is only something that a certain group of people who are part of the project experience and others aren't. It would be very challenging to create some kind of a geospatial connection with this, as far as from my perspective.
Okay, Johan.
Also, just a quick sort of reaction to this. I think there are a lot of potentials with these systems. There's no doubt. I mean, lack of data, lack of capacity to gather information is one of the most critical issues still in many areas. Not least when it comes to building adaptation strategies or whatever it might be. One aspect that is important to remember is who controls the information and the data. And actually, many of these new systems, in particular, if we are talking about remote sensing satellite data, it becomes very concentrated to a few countries. And there are a lot of legal aspects in all this. And sometimes they can be quite interesting when it comes to monitoring water resources or whatever it might be. So I just wanted to add that it's excellent if it's, as always, if it's used the right way, which is often the case with these kind of systems, but it can also be used in a way to control and others, and also dominate in terms of who owns the agenda.
Good, thank you, Johan. Yes, nothing happens in a vacuum, does it? It's all there are power patterns and all kinds of issues that emerge. We have, I think, a couple of other questions. I can read them. I see them. We have two questions. One asks about whether we can share examples of Sweden's future plans in terms of evaluation recommendations and how they will be taken into consideration. This is Cristina del Castillo from Oxfam Climate Initiative. And I think that is a question that should be directed to anyone representing the Swedish government or SIDA. So I think it may be a little bit premature, but just to let you know what we intend to do now. We will have workshops with both SIDA and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, partly overlapping workshops in order to look at recommendations and interpret them and see how they could be put into practice. And I assume that both the Ministry and SIDA will look carefully at the recommendations and sort of provide a kind of management response to them. So if you wait a while and maybe use your contacts in Sweden, I think we will be able to answer that question. We also have a question from Richard Klein to all the panelists. He says, if I interpreted the slide correctly, around 3/4 of the total climate change initiative budget was channeled through multilateral funds, with the remainder being spent bilaterally. Has the evaluation commented on whether or not this is the right proportion, which should more be spent bilaterally or less or differently? John, I think I'll ask you to comment on that, because I don't think you make a judgment in terms of how these resources were divided or distributed.
Yeah, that's right. We didn't make that judgment. And some of those we interviewed did comment that it's seen that Sweden had got swept up with investing much more strongly in multilateral than in bilateral funds, and not everyone was comfortable with that. But what I would say is that the experiment has run its course. And I think that what we're learning is that in some of the recommendations we're making, for example, around much better facilitation of a more joined up approach to the way that both multilateral and bilateral funds are used in country. I mean, if you take a country that wasn't actually in the evaluation, but one I know quite well, Malawi. I mean, Malawi depends on aid funding as much as it depends on government funding. That's the situation that Malawi finds itself in. And so the challenge is, and there's an enormous amount of funding pouring in from multiple sources. The challenge is how that funding is choreographed much more effectively to achieve social ecological resilience. And so I think efforts need to be spent in supporting better coordination at country level. We also made reference to potential investment and support for the LDC initiative for effective adaptation and resilience at country level. So I think there is a role now for Sweden to play in supporting that stronger country focus and bottom-up community focus, looking at how higher level inputs from multilateral funds are well used.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so it's for anyone to go in and sort of make a judgment whether was this the right distribution. We already heard one panelist, Johan, say that Sweden became a bit thin, particularly multilaterally, because of investing in so many funds. We have a question from that I think the Secretariat will read, from Gunnar Schölin.
Yes, the question is as follows. There is an inherent risk that a climate focus of aid reduces the development focus. Did the evaluators see any evidence of such a trade-off? Was there enough information to evaluate this?
Yeah.
Well, my question back would be, what is a development focus in a climate emergency world? What does that mean? I mean, the development, we're now trying to develop in particular directions in a climate and other emergency world.
Yeah, so this question was answered rhetorically. I think Johan waved, wanted to comment also on the previous question. Am I right, Johan?
Yeah, very quickly, since I made also the comment about going thin, I'm not arguing that the multilateral system is not the right sort of way of going. I'm just saying that we need to consider how we can be strategic in terms of working through the multilateral system, and at the same time also having a possibility to have an impact in terms of thought leadership. But I think Richard's question is very interesting in other dimensions as well, in particular, and it goes a little bit back to the question that we just had now, that what is essential when we broaden the climate agenda, which we should, I mean, making it more development oriented, is of course that we start to see this risk of overlapping mandates and so on between different UN agencies. Remember when I said I was working with UN Water. UN Water have 32 UN agencies as members, because 32 UN agencies have water on their agenda and in their mandate. And that I think is an aspect which is also very important for donors to consider, working together with the multilateral system, the UN system, to make sure that they are working efficiently and strategically, to use a couple of buzzwords.
Mm. Thanks, Johan. Lisa, please.
If it's okay, I just want to go back to that question about the risk of climate focus of aid, whether this reduces the development focus. Because I think in some ways this is an essential question that is something that I think everybody is constantly trying to sort of answer. And I mean, I thought that the example that Heather gave in her presentation about, how if you parachute into a situation, how can you make a distinction between what's adaptation and what's development and what needs to be done? And I think even if you looked at the examples from the kinds of things that had been done, I'm sorry, I can't remember which country it was now that you presented, John, but you had one of your circles where you talked about strengthening institutions. And, I think it's very valid to ask, like, in what way does strengthening institutions lead to adaptation? Can you categorize that as adaptation, or is that not just part of good sort of development? And so I think it really gets to the heart of the problem is, how do you make a distinction between these two things? And again, it doesn't actually really matter, but it does matter from a practical perspective, because the money is coming from different places and different groups have different ownership of this money. And so I think this is where it becomes, so it's a completely artificial debate in some ways, but unfortunately it's a debate that we have to have.
The solution to, the intertwining of development objectives and climate objectives in a climate changed world is not a simple thing to confront. And on the ground, it's much more straightforward than from this very privileged bird's eye vantage point that this question comes up from. And what Lisa has begun to describe there of, for any given needed outcome, how much of that is going to be done differently because the climate's changing, and how much of it is needed regardless of whether there's climate change. The solution that we've been heading toward is this idea of a climate hypothesis or a climate rationale. And in cases where it's really important to make this distinction, you can go through a process of saying, hey, here's what I understand about the climate change. Here's what I understand about vulnerability. Here's what I think is going to work best. And here's why. And that logic is your adaptation. And frankly, it's also your climate resilient development. That if you're just kind of doing development without thinking about climate change anymore, which I think was John's point with his initial rhetorical response to this question, that development is really at risk because the climate is changing, and it has changed. And so thinking that through is really important for development outcomes. The challenge that I think Lisa is getting at, and certainly Johan from a perspective with UN Water and other UN agencies, is that there's this overlapping mandate at this privileged bird's eye global level that's getting messier. And it's a practical question from that perspective, but it's really more of a practical question around mainstreaming climate and coordinating among institutions and readjusting the institutional mandates at this global level now that we recognize a climate crisis. At the local level, with the activists that I fund and the on-the-ground problem solvers, they don't think about this in this way at all. There's really no difference in terms of what they're trying to do. They're living with their evidence of climate change and their knowledge of it coming, and trying to do the best that they can with poverty reduction, with development, with COVID-19 response. All of this comes together in one place with the same people and the same set of tools.
I think that's always something for us to sort of consider and realize, and that we know from our own families, everything comes together at the level of the household, whatever we like to call it, who sit in the architecture of aid bureaucracies and so on. It all comes together at that level. We have a couple of, first we have a comment that Donatella would like to make, and then Torgny Holmgren would like to comment also. Is there any way to see what Donatella would like to say? Can she speak herself, or how do we do it?
Or alternatively, I can read the question.
Please.
We see if we find. Yeah, we could allow Donatella to speak as well.
Great. Please, Donatella.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you also see me?
No, we can't see anyone but ourselves, unfortunately.
Okay, no problem. So thank you for the opportunity. It was a very interesting discussion. As you can understand, I'm coming from a company that is its a primary role is in remote sensing. So that's why I was putting the question. And the question of using Earth observation technologies also for, let's say, monitoring investment is one of the recent developments on which we are working on. So that's why I was bringing as a contribute the fact that technologies have been evolving a lot into our sector, and that the possibility to monitor the use of development funds could be also done through remote sensing. Several countries have now remote sensing capabilities. So yes, it's true that a certain amount of countries have this knowledge, but it's in fact the possibility to involve local community in the use of this knowledge that can empower them to monitor not only climate change, but also how they spend the funds to combat climate change and adapt to it. So there are a lot of developments into our sector that I would like to bring a contribution. I just simply put a link of Copernicus. It's a program of the European Union, but obviously each nation has its own program. So definitely the possibility to empower local community with new technologies is also part of this resilience that we are talking about. My opinion, of course.
Thank you very much for your contribution and for the link. And again, I want to flag what the EBA published last year, a study on development, local development in Cambodia, and using remote sensing technology. It's quite interesting. Now, so Torgny Holmgren would like to comment on the issue of aid and climate. Can we listen to Torgny?
I hope so. I hope you hear my voice.
Yes.
Hi. Yes, interesting. Thanks, John and team and panelists for this discussion on a very important message and topic. I mean, yeah, when I heard the discussion on aid versus climate, because back when I was running this as part of the foreign ministry back in 2009, and at that time it was quite a huge discussion. Could we use development aid for climate-related measures? And I recall we ran an EU, as we were presidents of EU, we ran an EU meeting for all development ministers. And I recall that we put the question on the table, what is additionality? And all 27 countries have their own definition of what additionality was. But going back to the commission that you, Johan, also chaired or were General Secretary of, the Commission on Climate Change and Development, I think the outcome of that was it's more or less impossible to distinguish between climate and development. And today, I mean, think no one, I believe, believes that that is the case, because how can you run development in any developing countries without taking climate change into account? So I think that has changed, and I don't hear that discussion that often nowadays. But then back 10, 12 years ago, that was very on top of the agenda. Could you really use aid for climate change measures? And I think what we learned over the last 10 years is, yes, that is possible, and that should be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Torgny, for giving this historical perspective. And indeed, we spent a lot of time, and there was a lot of headaches around this distinction and the issue of additionality. Maybe I can ask Lisa, because you have been very much part of the adaptation development discourse for some years. Has it disappeared, this issue?
Well, I mean, thank you for giving me the opportunity, because actually I wrote my PhD in many ways looking at the relationship between adaptation and development. So that's 15 years ago. or 16 years ago. And I found that what's fascinating now is to see how it was like Heather mentioned, and like Torgny just said, the concept of additionality was the sort of the focus. Like, what additional money can we give so that it's climate change? And what's fascinating to me now is that actually, I don't think that the debate necessarily has been resolved, but I think what's happened is that we've got this idea of resilience that's come in and in some ways swept this debate a little bit under the rug, because resilience embodies both adaptation and development for many people. And so that's why we have this idea of climate resilient development, which I'm still struggling in my IPCC chapter to come to terms with. And so I think we've sort of created a new channel that allows us to avoid getting into the nitty-gritty, because I mean, I think as everybody said, and as Torgny said, climate, you can't talk about development without considering climate resilience. But it's somehow been sort of, I think in some ways the idea of resilience basically made that debate go away. But at the same time, it's not fully gone. I mean, I think we still have, within the Green Climate Fund, there's still some discussion, and they recently had, and probably some of the participants know more than I do about this, but there was recently a consultancy listed specifically for somebody to explore the difference between adaptation and climate change, and to make the kind of, development and adaptation, and to make it clear what can GCF fund. So, I mean, it's still there, but it was definitely pushed to the side.
It's lurking somewhere. It may reappear, who knows? And of course, it was very much at the time linked to the sort of existing basket of available development finance, and there was a sort of justice aspect to it, that money should not be used for something that basically the donor countries themselves had caused in terms of climate-related impacts and damage and so on and so forth. So therefore, climate funding should be additional to aid funding. We do not seem to have any one waiting to say something or ask a question or make a comment. We have about 15 minutes left. Maybe we could then do a little final round. And then I will make a little announcement of what EBA is doing next. But if panelists are ready, and John, to give the final comments, if you are ready to just give us a couple of thoughts, each one of you, based on what, anything that has emerged during this discussion, or points that you were not able to make earlier. So if we do it, can we do it in the reverse order? Johan, are you ready to share your thoughts?
Well, it's been a very interesting discussion, I think, and I would argue we have touched upon many of the complications related to climate change, adaptation, mitigation, development in today. I really think it would be interesting to look at, as I said in the end of my presentation, the very fast changing global landscape that we have right now, and how we can actually take some of the experience that we have from this initiative, and also not least the evaluation, and apply them on the situation that we have today, which is clearly quite interesting. And I know that these kind of sort of things are happening, but it would also be interesting to understand how this, a program like this, the Swedish, you could say, initiative, how that combined with what other countries were doing at this particular time, and how they acted, what kind of initiatives and policies they had, the bigger landscape, if you say that would be interesting. It's even more complicated, but I think it's, in the future, it will be more and more important that we are looking at, for instance, how the EU collectively is responding and acting in terms of these kind of programs. So these are loose thoughts, but thank you for a very interesting discussion, really.
Thank you, Johan. Heather, anything from DC?
Yes, thanks. It really has been a rich and fascinating discussion, and I hope there will be future evaluations like this of long time horizons and opportunities to learn. I thought I would reflect on a couple things that came up in the question set. In terms of remote sensing technology, there's a growing number of examples of really community-driven mapping exercises. Some of these are linked up with geospatial technology, others are still pretty low tech, but the fact of local control is really the key component of this, and the use of the mapping for empowerment of people who tend to be on the margins is a key thing to keep in mind from a climate change adaptation perspective. I'd recommend the Know Your City initiative from Slum Dwellers International as an example, where slum dwellers have been mapping their cities, and some of the insights that come from those maps are really powerful and important. Secondly, on this ongoing challenge of climate change versus development and how the two intersect, how we can best harmonize them, I did with Anne Hamel from the International Institute for Sustainable Development. She was another of the co-authors on the continuum back in 2007, and we wrote a reflection about a year and a half ago, looking back 10 years on the continuum and on some of the resurging debates, particularly, as Lisa said, within the Green Climate Fund around this difference. And I recommend that blog to you. I think it came out as a commentary on the IISD website. I think one of the takeaways, though, for me from this ongoing debate is that it is a privileged debate. It is a challenge that those of us working at the global level and those of us deploying funding have. And climate justice calls for us to solve that challenge ourselves and not to foist it onto local communities and onto the recipients of funding and the beneficiaries of funding. So I think there's clearly still challenges and tasks ahead of us on this, and perhaps we could call on Sweden to continue its leadership in terms of institutions and some of the real successes on coordination that this evaluation has found, that maybe there's an opportunity here at that global level for better alignment and resolution of this adaptation development challenge. Thank you again for this opportunity. It's really been a very rich conversation.
Thank you very much, Heather. And I'm sure Swedish government took note of your encouraging the Sweden to continue along these lines. And also, I think we can all Google Heather McRae and Anne Hamel, IISD, reflection on the continuum. And also, I think fascinating to hear about how these, what have been seen as very sort of complicated high-tech issues are now being used for really local empowerment. Lots to continue working on there. Thanks. So Lisa, please.
Yeah, thanks. So I guess for me, maybe there are two things that stand out here. And one of these is, like I mentioned earlier, I was working on this review of adaptation projects which essentially identified how many initiatives are actually contributing to vulnerability in different ways. I'm not going to go into that now. But I was doing this at the same time as I was part of being able to sit in a sort of bird's eye view of the evaluation, which was really, really satisfying. And I think these, to me, we still need to ask questions around whose adaptation we're talking about. Of course, my focus on adaptation. So who adaptation for whom? And I think this gets back to the question of ownership and agency, but really it's about sort of who's responsible and what do we expect out of these projects and initiatives. It doesn't only come back to the definition of adaptation, but it really sort of is this adaptation interpreted by some external actor or a local implementing group, or is this adaptation interpreted by the person or the people who will be the beneficiaries? I think one other thing that is crucial is to again raise this word transformation, because transformation at its sort of more idealistic, we're talking about really the need to rethink the terms of engagement and the way that we need to rethink development and in our institutional setup. And so I think maybe, this evaluation has raised a lot of really fascinating points about what seems to work and what may not work so well, but also to raise the questions around these different vertical and horizontal linkages and institutions and governance, which all aid actors should understand. So I think, I guess those are the two things that I would just finish with.
Thank you. Yeah, so let's continue asking adaptation for whom and who decides. John, would you like to give us a final reflection on what you have heard in terms of comments and questions and new perspectives that have been brought in that we may not have thought about sufficiently when this evaluation was commissioned?
Sure. And I'd like to pick up on themes that various people have mentioned in different ways. The question is now, and I want to link back to the slides I started with and the slides I finished with. The question is now, in a COVID world, how Sweden might use the learning from this evaluation and the discussions that are emerging around it. As I said at the start of our presentation, last year we were in a climate and biodiversity emergency. Now we're in a climate, biodiversity and COVID emergency. And we're trying to think, and it's very difficult to think about this, but there's a lot of activity around this because of the opportunities that have been opened up. We're trying to think about post-COVID scenarios and how we might prepare for those, even though they're incredibly uncertain. And I mean, I've seen a number of scenarios, reports published recently that I think do help us to start to think about these issues, one from Deloitte, another from Packard Foundation. And the kinds of issues that they're highlighting are that what's going to happen depends, of course, partly on the severity of this pandemic, and we have really no idea how that's going to play out. But also, what will happen will also depend on how smart we can be as a planet, from communities up to international bodies, on collaboration and coordination. And that theme has been a central theme of this evaluation. We've called it governance in some places, but it's something that Sweden has, I think, come out well in terms of how it facilitates and encourages and fosters collaboration and governance that is better informed by the bottom up. And so I think Sweden has an important role to play in helping us to find our way through and out of this emergency. And I think that raises questions about where are the entry points to have the debate around what we must do next. And I want to put one particular entry point on the table, which is food security. Because for the majority world, the issue that's coming out of COVID isn't necessarily being infected, but sustaining livelihoods and not starving because of the way that the food chains are impacted. And the issue of food security is also very much linked to bushmeat and the origins of zoonotic diseases. And these are some of the issues I was raising in my last slide. And these are all interlinked with health. So I think we need to be thinking about food security in a climate, biodiversity and COVID emergency world and what we do next. And I also think we need to be thinking about finance, because this evaluation has been about the use of finance and how it's directed. And I mean, one of the brightest spots that remains or is emerging at the moment is the EU Green Deal or Green New Deal. But what about the international development cooperation response? What kind of deal do we want to negotiate? And whose voices are going to count in that deal? And to come back to some of the points that Heather was making, we really have to think about ways in which financing can be even more strongly or much more strongly directed towards the most vulnerable communities. And I think a very exciting example of that, and I'm just going to mention one, is a new initiative, although it's been brewing for a number of years, called 1,000 Landscapes for 1 billion People. And in that initiative, a key element is about how finance can really be made available to communities and collaborative communities working at a landscape level, and how that finance can be focused around what they need for landscape restoration. So I think I'd like to end on those two reflections, that the question of entry points and opportunities at this very unique time around food security and finance, I think are really worth thinking about as Sweden thinks about its role and its leadership role and its thought leadership role going forwards. So thanks very much to Heather and Johan and Lisa and Johan for this discussion and opportunity. And I'm very excited to see how this all goes forward. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you to your whole team. Unfortunately, we did not have time to invite them all to speak and to comment, but our thanks go to them. And I think what you say is also well received from the point of EBA. We are going to reflect both on what is it in this evaluation that we may need to and should take forward, what new insights and questions have emerged that we should continue to work on. So I think this final reflecting session has been very important for us. And we are also, like many other evaluating government entities, we're also, of course, looking at the COVID-19 crisis and see what is it that we could do and when should we do it. And clearly we are now seeing and learning things that some we could have expected, but there's so much new aspects of vulnerability and weaknesses and so on that we see that were not visible before this happened. So clearly something for us to really take very seriously and see what we could possibly address. So thank you all, John, Lisa, Heather, and Johan, and thank you for Mats and Jack in our secretariat. Just to say now that we will have another seminar in the near future. The date hasn't been set yet, but that will be on a study on the relationship between program and administrative costs in Swedish development cooperation. This will be a study in the Swedish language. We hope there will be also an English summary, but it's sort of fairly much directed to a Swedish government and governance context. You can go to our website, www.eba.se, and you can get our newsletter and look at other invitations for new seminars. And for Swedish speakers, there's also a podcast, the EBA Pod, which is a fairly new initiative, but we are very proud because we have listeners in more than 50 countries. And we usually, it's likely that this webinar will also be followed by a podcast when we will invite a few people to discuss the evaluation and what has come out of this, of the webinar. So thank you, everybody on the screen and everybody who has been involved and listening out in cyberspace. Stay safe. We hope to meet you again soon. Thank you all.